Buongiorno, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in and listening to this session about how we can make WebAuthn easy to adopt for developers, hence easy for end users to enjoy as soon as possible. My name is Vittorio Bertocci. I work as an architect at Auth0, an identity as a service provider that pays particular attention to developers, hence the topic of this session. Now, the fact that the industry came together to standardize on WebAuthn, operating system vendors, browser vendors, is a remarkable achievement. It's amazing, it's fantastic. However, it is only the first step. We now need to actually get adoption in the world. And for developers in particular, this can actually be some work. The designers of the protocol did everything they could to make the surface as easy and intuitive as possible. However, it's still work on top of existing apps. And so, of course, with that comes friction. During this session, I'm going to focus on the strategy, the approach that we are using at Auth0 for making the process easier for developers. And in fact, we are using the same pattern that we used for simplifying many other aspects of the identity complexities that developers normally need to deal with. And we'll see that it's just as easy as offloading the mechanics to an authentication service. So I'm going to spend most of the session in there. And then I'm going to spend some time to reason about the differences between using security keys and using platform authenticators, so biometrics and similar. Again, the protocol designers did a great job to use the same approach between the two. And so very often you see services that present those under the same umbrella. However, they are very different from a usability perspective. And so it makes sense when you offer those as features to developers to actually differentiate them. Now, if you are attending Authenticate, chances are that you have a very good idea of how WebAuthn works. However, it's worth to invest a couple of minutes to see in details what happens when a developer needs to take an existing app and plaster WebAuthn support on top of it. So what you see in here is on the left side, a classic browser on a desktop. On the right side, you see an application that runs on the web. Now, what do we need to do to support WebAuthn? The idea is that there are APIs in the browser that the web application can leverage to actually prompt the ceremony that you have for WebAuthn. And in particular, what does it mean in practice? That means that you need to enhance your web application with some prompting logic that actually serves to the browser the code that needs to be done for starting the enrollment in this particular case. And so in this particular case, you have this code, imagine it's JavaScript. If you want to see the details of this, you can actually go to many different websites that will give you primers on how WebAuthn works. In particular, in Auth0, we put together very early on this website called WebAuthn.me, where you can just explore in details how those flows work. And the icons that you see in there are just screenshots of these particular snippets of code. So if you want details, you can go there. Now, the idea is that you have this prompting logic, which sends that code, which calls APIs for starting the ceremony. And as part of these, you actually send to the browser what we call a challenge, which is just a couple of bits that we want to sign. Calling this API will prompt the user to present an authenticator, let's say something like a YubiKey. And then once you place the authenticator in there, what will happen is that you can actually provide a signature for your challenge. And now at this point, you can send back the challenge to the website. And now you need more logic on the website to process this challenge, in particular, check that the signature performed by this key was actually valid, and then take this key and associate it with the authenticator to the end user. And then at that point, when you want to authenticate the user after enrolling, you again use the prompting, but this time to send a GET. Again, you send your challenge. Once again, this challenge will be signed by the authenticator, and then you just send a challenge back, and your cryptologic check that the key is the same, and all it's done. Now, it's not absolutely rocket science, like it is, it is actually pretty straightforward. However, it is extra work that developers need to put in, and it's not particularly trivial. In fact, all the part about prompting, you'll see many, many tutorials on the internet. But for example, how to actually save and associate keys to end users, there are not a lot of places where developers can learn how to do it. So this thing is non-trivial. Now, how can we simplify the task for developers? Here is how, one way in which you can do it. Imagine that you have an authentication service. And imagine that your application trusts this authentication service using some kind of open protocol, such as OpenID Connect. This is what millions of applications do every day today. And now imagine that you can just imagine this is a boundary, take all the code which is necessary for performing the WebAuthn ceremony, all the code which is necessary for tracking user credentials in this way, and just place it in there. At this point, your application needs to do exactly nothing to support WebAuthn, because if you are already outsourcing authentication to this central service, then all you are doing is using a feature of a service, just like all the other features you already have in place. And now your end users will be able to enjoy WebAuthn directly without you having to do any work in your app. Now, I just want to show how this works. So let me give you a very quick example of this. What I have in here is an ultra simple application. It's an app that uses OpenID Connect in Node.js. It's connected to Auth0, and it's outsourcing authentication to Auth0 in there. So let me just run it, and let's see what is the experience without WebAuthn. So run it. It's running in here. I'm using a proxy, of course, because I want HTTPS. And now let me open a browser. And too many monitors for my own good. And let's go to localhost. Okay, here I'm just signing in. I have a number of identity providers, all standard signing in. Coming here, I'm signing in. As you can see here, the system recognizes me. Now let's say that I want to add WebAuthn to this app. Now, the way in which I can do this is I just go on my dashboard, which contains all my settings for my authentication service. You can go to my multi-factor auth. I can say, I want to use security keys, and I want all of my apps to do this. So here, I apply my policy. Great. And then at this point, I can just again, go to my app. Note that I didn't stop my app. I didn't have to restart. Like, the app is still running on the background. And now let's say HTTPS, localhost. I sign in like before. But now I'm prompted to use my key. And here, Excalibur. I have my fantastic YubiKey. which is a 5CI. It's a little miracle. It has a lightning connector versus USB-C connector on the other side. All I need to do is to place it in my USB-C. You hear that my Windows felt that. As I continue, here it wants me to touch it, so I'm touching it. Okay, I name it. Of course, no one ever records the code, but we ask for it anyway for due diligence. And as you can see now, I'm signed in. And again, not only I didn't have to change anything in my app, I didn't even have to put it down. And now I can just go back on my dashboard and do any modification I want. So this is what we think is going to be the best way of getting or WebAuthn adopted by adding it on top of what we already have. Then, of course, the goal is eventually to get it to have WebAuthn end-to-end, but this is a great intermediate step. Now, again, we have seen that in this approach, I actually used WebAuthn as a second authentication factor rather than the primary one. And the main advantage was mainly no development effort. Like, I just outsourced this to my source. Like, I was already using an authentication service. I just flipped a switch in there. The other advantage is you have seen me use username and password in this example, but I could have used any other identity provider among the ones that the authentication service supports. And as an outcome, I would have been able to add WebAuthn as an extra factor, regardless of what the identity provider supports. And so that would allow me to enhance existing flows. So another value that we give to developers. And then, of course, by having these centralized, lots of advantages that are not directly germane to WebAuthn, but that you can apply, such as you apply WebAuthn to all of the apps that are using the same service at the same time. So instead of having to code every single app singularly. And then, of course, I can combine it with multiple factors, as we'll see it later on. So very useful. Now, given our approach to our developers, this is how we are staging our rollout of WebAuthn support. Right now, we have the security keys directly supported in beta at this point. Then, very soon, we are going to have the biometrics, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. We're just going to add also platform support. And then eventually, next year, we are going to also add the WebAuthn as a main factor. So not as an extra factor, but as the main one. And this is only for the scenarios where customers use us as main identity provider, as opposed to federation provider and intermediary with other identity providers. And depending on the type of service that you're using, others might be following a different roadmap, but this is the one that we devised for promoting adoption with developers. Now, let's talk for a second about the differences between using a security key and using a platform authenticator. One of the things is that if today you go to GitHub, now, today as the moment in which we are recording, then the moment in which you will listen to this session, things might be different because they change literally daily. But today, if you go on GitHub, and you try to use WebAuthn as your second factor, both security keys and biometrics as offered by your device will be under the umbrella security key. Like in their UI, they'll say security key. And we have some usability studies that show that a lot of users are confused about it, as in like, wait, I want to use my thumb, or I want to use my Face ID. I don't have a security key. And given that from the protocol perspective, the two are the same, and given that there is a lot of demand on the enterprise side for using the key, very often the user experience puts both under the same moniker, but that confuses people. And so our conclusion is that we want, despite the fact that the two operate in the same way at the protocol level, we want to keep them separated so that both the developer and the user can really reason well about it. And in fact, here, the way in which we are going to surface this is by having a different, distinct, dedicated entry in our features so that you can turn it on and off independently from keys, even if both are using the WebAuthn protocol underlying. Now, the other aspect to think about this is that when a user is using a device as opposed to a key, now the device in itself becomes a critical aspect of the entire flow. So if you register one device as your second factor, and now you're accessing the service from a different device, now you are in trouble. What are you going to do? Like if the device was your only second factor, then you are going to be in trouble. Or like if your device suddenly gets lost, or you lose it, or you buy a new one and you forget to move the settings. So there are all sorts of things that can go wrong when you use a device as a factor. And so the outcome of this is we can't just use it as a standalone extra factor like we do with keys. And here to explain this, I'm going to use a website that we put together in Auth0 for explaining, for helping developers to explain and understand what experience their end user will have when they use an authentication service. And so we have like various flows that we show in here. Like when you go in here, you can explore what the UI will look like for different flows. And we have exactly the same approach also when we talk about WebAuthn. In particular, what you see in here is the diagram of the experience that we have seen when we use the security key. So in particular, we see that we sign in with first factor, then we add the security key, we go through the experience, we name it, and we are done. Now, if we go through the biometric flavor of this flow, so the platform authenticator, what happens is slightly different. What happens is first, you have your usual factor, but then after that, we ask you to go through the enrollment of another factor that is not a biometric factor. So something that will be available should you have to do a recovery flow. And in fact, here you see the list of other extra factors that we offer apart from the biometric one. And then after you're done with that, we now present you with the opportunity to register this device. And that's how we present it, as in like, okay, this is going to be a faster way for you to access the service when you go through the device. And we just walk you through the process. And here you can see the difference in which we are talking about security keys or we are talking about device. So again, we make it super clear both to the developer and to the end user that those two things are different. And now I'd like to show you also a quick demo of the platform, but it's still super early days, so I don't know if it will work. So I'm going to try it anyway. Let me try to sign up with a new user. Here, I'm just going to suggest a strong password. Sure. Now, this one is my first, is the first account, the first second factor that I mentioned earlier. So let me get an Authenticator app on my phone. Let me scan the barcode. And let's see, what code would that be? I'm always very anxious when there is this thing that is like, the time is running out for using this code. Okay, so now I went through my first two steps, and now I have my biometric. And so when I go to my device, just look down to my fantastic surface. It recognizes me. And so now I went through my flow and I registered. And here we just have our test that shows that, yes, I did get a token. So very straightforward, very easy for the developer to set up, and very clear for the end user that this is a different flow, and still maintaining the ability to have the recovery options that we expect. Now, I just had a very little time here and I barely scratched the surface, but I hope I gave you a good feeling of what it takes for developers to adopt WebAuthn if you use an authentication service. If you wanted to dig a bit deeper, you can go to the website that I mentioned, where you'll see some of the underlying details of the protocol. Then we have an episode for our podcast where we had as a guest John Bradley from Ubico, and he goes into the details of WebAuthn and especially some aspects of the history that are really, really interesting. So if you are into podcasts, I highly recommend that episode. And then we have our announcement in which, if you are interested in what Auth0 did for WebAuthn, you can go at that link and you can follow us on Twitter. And if you want to ask me questions, the best way is Twitter. If you send me an email, I'm not always very quick, but if you shame me on Twitter, then I am forced to respond right away. So that's what I recommend. So in summary, the adoption of WebAuthn is a journey. The standardization was a huge step, an incredible step. But now we've got to roll our sleeves and help the industry to adopt. And if you provide a staged approach in which you make every step easy, and at every step the developer can see a concrete advantage rather than just a down payment for a future, like right now, whatever I do right now will give value to me and to my end user, then we are convinced that we can really push for adoption and make the internet safer for everyone. Thank you. And I'm sure that you already asked the questions during the session, but now we start the official Q&A period. Thank you.